Good morning, Honors Algebra 1. It is Tuesday, April 28th, and we're continuing on in Chapter 12 with Section 2, Completing the Square. This is going to be a second technique to solve a quadratic equation. In Section 1, we isolated our quadratic term, our squared variable term, and then we took the square root of both sides to solve it. Now, this is going to be a little bit more complex, so bear with me. We need to do a little bit of introduction here, and that is, here we have x squared plus 8x plus 16 is a perfect square trinomial. If I were to factor it, I would get x plus 4 in parentheses squared. Now, notice that in the trinomial, the first term, the square root, is x, the first term in the binomial. And the last term, 16, its square root is the second term in the binomial. And now also notice that if I take this x plus 4, multiply x times 4 and get 4x and double it, I get the middle term of my trinomial. Now, another thing to notice is that if I have the coefficient of my middle term in the trinomial, let's have it. Half of 8 is 4, and square it, I get the last constant term. Have the coefficient of x and square it, I get 16. Let's look down here. X minus 5 squared becomes x squared minus 10x plus 25. This is the square of the first term. This 25 is the square of the last term. If I take negative 5x, the product of the first and last term, negative 5x, and double it, I'll get the middle term here. Also notice that if I take half of the coefficient of negative 10 is negative 5, and I square that, I will get 25. So here is my perfect square trinomial that can be factored as x minus 5 squared. Now, what we're going to do over here is we are going to take the first two terms in a trinomial, and we're going to create the last constant term to create a trinomial that is a perfect square trinomial. Here we have a perfect square trinomial. Here we have a perfect square trinomial, okay? And remember, the pattern is you take the coefficient of the x term, or whatever variable you're using, have it and square it. 4 squared, 16. Negative 10 divided by 2, or negative 5 squared, 25. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take the 14 and we're going to have it to 7, and then we're going to square it. Well, 7 squared is 49, and 49 is completing the square, because this now becomes a perfect square trinomial that can be factored to x plus 7 squared, okay? So if you have on the homework, it has two terms in the trinomial and tells you to complete the square to make this a perfect square trinomial. You will have the coefficient of your first degree term, your x term, or whatever variable you have, and you're going to have it and square it. Okay, now this one's a little bit more difficult, isn't it? Because the coefficient is negative 9. I'm going to have it. I'm going to use the same pattern. I'm going to have it and square it. So if I have it and square it, I get 81 fourths, because half of negative 9 is negative 9 halves. Don't go decimal on me here. Okay, keep it fraction. And so I've got 81 over 4. Now, if I factor that, I'm going to put it down here, that would be x minus, excuse me, square root of this is going to be 9 halves. And this perfect square trinomial factors to x minus 9 halves squared. And we have a factored binomial that is squared, okay? It is the factorization of my perfect square trinomial. Now, let's go ahead now and use this technique of completing the square to solve a quadratic equation. Now, this quadratic equation right here, y squared plus 8y equals 10, there are several steps. The first step is this. You want to have your constant term moved to the right side of the equation. Now, in this case, the 10 has already been moved over. It's already been moved over, so I've already done, step 1's already been done for me. We move the constant to the right side. Now, with what is left on the left side, we are going to complete the square. We are going to create a perfect square trinomial here. And how do I do it? I'm going to halve the 8. Well, half of 8 is 4. And I'm going to square 4, and I'm going to get a positive 16. Now, this is an equation. And so if I add 16 to the left side, I'm going to have to keep this equation balanced by adding 16 to the right side. And this is the one step that most Algebra 1 students will forget. They will forget to add the 16 to the other side, and then you can't get the right answer. Okay, so now let's go ahead on the left side, and what we're going to do, this is going to be the beauty of this, is we're going to factor this perfect square trinomial. All right, well, the square root of y squared is y. The square root of 16 is 4, and this is a plus sign, so I have y plus 4 squared. Y plus 4 squared gives me y squared plus 8y plus 16 when I multiply it out. Now let's go to the other side and see what we get. We get, 10 plus 16 is 26. Okay, now let's go ahead and solve this. We're going to solve it for y. Well, we've done this from section 12.1. If I have a binomial squared on this side, I can just take the square root of both sides. So the square root here would be y plus 4. On this side, I put the plus minus square root of 26. Okay, don't forget the plus minus on this side. And my final answer is y equals negative 4 plus minus root 26. And there is your answer. I believe the directions on the homework will say give irrational roots in simplest radical form. Okay, so the root of 26, that cannot be simplified. That's 2 times 13. But let's say it was the root of 8. You'd make it 2 root 2. Okay, and then it says, then approximate the answer to the nearest 10th. They want you to take your calculator and do negative 4 plus, and then give an approximation of adding root 26 and subtracting root 26. You don't have to do that. You can just give me the answer in radical form and be done with it. I'm okay with that. You do not have to convert it to a decimal form at all. So this will be your answer and you're done, okay? Now let's try another one. That one wasn't so bad. Let's try one that becomes a little bit more difficult over here because my coefficient of x is an odd number. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit more difficult. Now, let's go ahead. The first thing we do is we have to bring the constant to the other side. And so it's going to equal positive 18. Now, I'm going to go ahead and leave a space here to complete the square. Let me have a little water here. I'm going to leave a space here to complete the square. Okay, now be very careful here. I'm going to put it up here so you can see it. Negative 3, and I'm going to divide it by 2. My coefficient is halved, and then I'm going to square it. And I'm going to get this icky fraction. Don't go decimal, okay? Keep it a fraction. This is going to become 9/4. So it becomes plus 9/4. Now, what am I going to have to do on the other side? I'm going to have to add 9/4. I'm going to have to add 9/4. I'm getting my calculator ready. Okay, so I'm going to add 9/4 to keep it balanced. Now, let's go ahead and write this side. We've completed the square. We've made it a perfect square trinomial. Now we're going to write it in factored form. And so it's going to become x, okay, a minus. Now the square root of 9/4 is 3/2 squared, okay? And that equals, well, let's go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and add 18 plus 9/4 and see what I get. 18 plus 9 divided by 4 gives me that. Math, enter, enter. I'm getting 81/4. Oh, I like that. Okay. Now, let's go ahead and take the square root of both sides. So I have x minus 3/2 equals plus minus the square root of 81/4. Can you do this in your head with me? Sure you can. The square root of 81 is 9. The square root of 4 is 2. All right, that was nice. So now let's go ahead and solve for x. X equals, add 3/2. Over here I have 3/2 plus or minus 9/2. Now, you cannot leave it like that, okay? You cannot leave it like that. You've got to combine these two because they're both rational numbers. They're both rational numbers. So let's first add. My first option is to add. What is 3 halves plus 9 halves? Well, 3 halves plus 9 halves is 12 halves, which is 6. So 6 is one of my answers. Let's do 3 halves minus 9 halves. Well, 3 minus 9 is negative 6, so I get negative 6 halves, and negative 6 halves is negative 3. Negative 3. Okay, and that is my answer by completing the square. Now, let me tell you this. When you get answers like this, where you get two integer answers means that this also factored. So remember, we've solved quadratics by factoring. We've solved quadratics by factoring. So let me just show you something real quickly here. Now, when you do the work for me, if it says to complete the square, you've got to complete the square. However, let me just show you here that this factors to x minus 6 times x plus 3 equals 0. Remember how we did that in a previous lesson? Oh, can you see that? There you go, okay? And so when I FOIL this, I get this. This is perfect factor. And so x equals 6, x equals negative 3. So if we didn't have to complete the square, factoring would have been the easiest way to do it. But it told us to complete the square. And actually, on your homework on 13 through 17 odd, you're going to have to do it by completing the square and by factoring. So it's going to make you do it two ways. So complete the square and then also go back and factor it and show me that you can solve it that way as a remembrance of how we used to do it. Okay, now let's go ahead and do the last one. Now, what is different about this is that my leading coefficient is not 1, it's a 5. Well, you cannot complete the square with a coefficient, a leading coefficient other than 1. In other words, your x squared term has to have a coefficient of 1. So we are going to have to force this thing to have a 1 here instead of a 5. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and divide every term by 5. And while we're doing it, remember our first step, move the constant to the other side. So this is going to become x squared dividing by 5 plus 8/5 x, leave a space, equals, this would normally be negative 1, but I'm going to also divide that term by 5. And look what I have. Okay, now let's keep going. Let's go ahead and complete the square on this side. I've left my blank, okay? When you complete the square, this will always be a positive number because even if this is a negative coefficient or a positive, if you square a negative or a positive, you will always get a positive product. Now, I'm going to come over here and take 8/5, and I'm going to take half of it first. Well, half of 8/5 is 2/5, right? No, it's not 2/5, my word, it's 4/5. Half of 8/5 is 4/5, excuse me. And now I'm going to square 4/5. I'm going to square 4/5, and I'm going to get 16/25. Okay, now I have halved this. Half of 8/5 is 4/5. I'm going to square it, and my number goes right here. I have completed the square to make a perfect square trinomial. I have to add 16/25 to both sides of my equation. I'm going to go ahead and erase this. Okay, let's go ahead and write this in factored form, and so that becomes x plus, this term will be the square root of this, which is 4/5, x plus 4/5 squared, okay? Now the right side is going to be 1/5, well it's going to be, let me get my calculator again, it's going to be 16/25 minus 1/5, which I could do without that, but I'm just going to be lazy here. Okay, 11/25, and so I get 11 over 25. Okay, now let's go ahead and take the square root of both sides. I get x plus 4/5 equals positive negative root 11/25. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and isolate x. X equals negative 4/5 plus minus. Now, I'm going to break this up into the root of 11 over the root of 25, which is 5. Now, you can leave your answer like this. This is fine. You might also see this in the book, and I'm just peeking real quick to see. Yeah, what they will do is they will combine these two. And so I have -4 rational before the irrational, -4 plus minus, they have the, yep, root 11 over 5. I have to always check because sometimes different textbooks like to write it different ways. Okay, now there is my answer to that problem. And you may leave your answer with the plus minus here. I'm noticing in the book that they write it as -4 plus root 11 over 5 and -4 minus root 11 over 5. They do it that way. You do not have to do that plus minus. It'll save you a step there. Okay. So that is completing the square. It's a little bit more involved. I understand that. And so if you need some extra help, come to Zoom at 11 o'clock this morning and I can do some of these problems with you. All right. So have a great Tuesday and I'll see you at 11 or I'll see you, well, I won't see you. I'll talk to you Wednesday morning. Bye-bye.